Hi, welcome to Leading Edge Forum session. The open door isn't closing. I'm Devin Safran, Client Success Director for the Leading Edge Forum in North America. And I am joined today by my esteemed colleague and lead researcher, Chris Daniel, author of the report that will serve as the foundation for today's discussion. Just a quick programming note that today's session is being pre-recorded. And should you have any follow-up questions, want to continue the discussion, we will make sure to share our information at the end, and don't hesitate to reach out. So Chris, as we talk about the topic today, I know you've done quite a lot of research for the LEF. You've covered quite a few topics. What made this an important one to address?
Thank you, Devon. Actually, it was my past personal experience in the open source world because I worked a number of years first at the Eclipse Foundation supporting Eclipse projects, then at the Red Hat. I was quite captivating by the ideas that circulate in the open source movement. I was under the influence of the previous report that Leading Edge Forum published in 2012 about increasingly open strategies for the world. And given all of that, I've started observing many signals that open source wasn't doing that great as before. We've got a number of reports telling us that the open source was growing in China, but when I tried to check that, there was no proof of it. A number of projects that were listed in the 2012 report, they've just ceased to function. More from the community itself, there were coming words, there were coming informations about wars on conflicts between different companies engaged in the same group of projects. So basically, I thought it was worth to revisit this area and figure out what's happening out there. And upon the first inspection, what I saw is basically the white noise. Some projects were clearly no longer maintained, but the amount of new open source initiatives was unprecedented. Some people complained about sustainability, but we found examples of projects which received serious financial donations and contributors had no idea how to use that money. They basically stashed it and waited for better times or worse times. Open source in China was supposed to be booming, as I have said, but apart from a few projects and a clone of GitHub, it was quite difficult to find any outstanding activity which could match the one that we can find at the Apache Foundation. More hardware cannot be technically open source. I will get back to it. But we found communities that were built around the concept of open hardware. Some open projects were called open, but the community was in internal conflict whether those projects are open indeed. And to add even more, I found some foundations stating that everything should be open by default. Yet we found examples where being open actually killed the project. So to disentangle the situation, we had to go back to the roots and figure out what being open actually means. And to my surprise, and I had prior experience in the open source space, I've learned that open source is almost a legal definition. There is a group or a foundation called the Open Source Initiatives. This group maintains a checklist of 10 positions, and if the license of the code matches those conditions, the software is called open. If it doesn't, technically you shouldn't be using the term open source, but there is nothing that can prevent you from doing that. While some lawyers claim that the checklist is internally contradictory, with some degree of goodwill, it's possible to understand what open source is in terms of the definition that's maintained there. But because open source definition is so restrictive, and because it talks about the software code, it doesn't cover open hardware, data, ecology. Those things aren't technically open source. Neither are projects that have public source codes. Like you can download it and see how those projects work, but you cannot, for example, redistribute modifications that you will make. And actually, when I was looking into that space, I found that community is quite unhappy with the proliferation of open source licenses. There are plenty of them. And you can even find risk analysis in which those licenses are ranked from the business most friendly to business most unfriendly. But the biggest surprise was that we found that that open source projects could be used to achieve a very broad set of goals, from creating future world to stifling competition. And if the same license can be used to achieve different results, focusing on the license is a very wrong thing to do. Licenses are important, but not the most important aspect of open source. And if you consider non-software aspects of open approaches, such as open hardware, open data, open standard, we had to redefine for the purpose of the research what is an open approach. And we basically changed or broadened the definition from source code license to the license that grants you some freedoms. Now, what freedoms those are is a subject for a separate discussion, but they, in the beginning, should at least cover the right to modify and redistribute, to modify the project you are getting and to redistribute the changes and inspect the code to learn how this works. Of course, this becomes a bit more complicated in the hardware world because it means that the designs and specifications should be open. It opens a lot of questions about the responsibility and who should be blamed if the design doesn't work in a particular use case. But then we found that even if the source code license or the license is extremely permissive, it's just a small fraction of the overall picture because trademarks, patents, and communities tend to be used to limit the ability to exercise rights granted by the license. So from the one point of view, you get the right to inspect the code, modify it, and ship it to other people. But from the other point of view, trademarks, patents, markets, communities prevent you from doing that. Think, for example, of a popular content management system, Wordpress. Wordpress is licensed under GPL, which means that you can take the code, modify it, run, and redistribute it as long as you maintain the original license. But to do it successfully, you would have to use the WordPress logo. Just say, this is my version of the WordPress. But the, excuse me, but the WordPress trademarks guideline says that you can't do that unless your company's engagement into the WordPress project is non-commercial in nature. So the license allows you to do plenty of stuff with the code itself, but you can't do actually anything useful with that code. And I'm very far from judging this gap between the license and the reality and the control checks put by trademarks and the community. Because if WordPress would be easy to clone, we would get something similar to what happened to Unix. Different providers would add proprietary features and would be reluctant to contribute back to the shared code base. We would get different flavors of the same software from different providers. With trademark control, they cannot do that, which kind of ensures the project prosperity and promises us that nobody will be able to monetize this content management system directly. What companies involved in this space do, they usually sell some add-ons like templates for websites or plugins which extend the base functionality, but they cannot take the initial project out from the market. On the other hand, I found examples of projects that were meant to be spread and customized. Open source games are a very good category of those projects. A game like a NetHack, which is a fantasy game, has a large number of forks. The differences are very small, but people basically create their own version and say, hey, this is NetHack, note the trademark, but it was created by me, check if it's fun to play. So with those observations, the question becomes, if it's not about the license, if it's not only about the trademarks and patents and not only about community, then what is that matter? What is that defines the open approach? And this is where we came with the concept of intent. Intent is about what the original contributor meant to achieve by setting a project in this specific way, by using open license, by setting up proper trademark and patents policy, and by restricting or not restricting the community. If you want something to be widely used, you will find a way, even if you are not using open approaches. But if you are using open approaches, your chances are a bit bigger because potential customers can check the source code and see what it does. Inspecting the intent is very difficult, or diagnosing the intent is a very difficult task, mostly because the open communities, well, they trace their origins to the early hacker ethos, to the group of people that built the first Unix operating system. Those people worked because they wanted to do something great. And for many people in the Western cultures, this is something extremely attractive. It's attractive from the PR perspective. It's attractive as a perk in your daily job if you can contribute to open source. But in the Eastern culture, especially in China, people don't do that. And those values are a big source of confusion because people who believe in those values, they work on various projects, even those that have purely economical goals. So if you want to diagnose or define why a particular project was made open, you have to completely ignore what the community says and focus on what it does. What I found useful is thinking about this triangle between contributors, solutions, and users. Contributors open the solution, they give up control over the solution and allow others to use it. Users adopt it, but there is unwritten rule, and a very weak one, which is that users contribute back either by recognition, which means that contributors get appraisal, either commercial requests, contributors get paid gigs, and they used earnings to sponsor the open solution, or contributors can get fast feedback, which is actually quite useful if we are in a highly changing, in an environment that changes in a very fast way. Most of the time, the feedback is bidirectional, so it's basically open communication. Note that there are two different open words in this space. One relates to giving up control over the solution, and the other one means transparency. You don't have to open your solution to use open communication mechanism that can be found in the open source projects. You can just adopt those management practices and embed them in your organization and build something which is called internal open source. But what is important that when this loop closes, you get a sensing engine. You can learn from your users faster than competition that doesn't use open approaches. You have people with their networks who can talk to you and who can basically gather and channel ideas into your projects. Sometimes we get donations in this space flowing from users to contributors, but we will talk about donations a bit later. And now we have to talk about a very interesting situation. It's when we get another party which takes the solution, offers a slightly better version or a different version or a managed version, and users stop talking to initial contributors. They stop sending commercial requests to initial contributors, but they start liaising with the corporation or organizations who offer the managed version of a service. Imagine, for example, that you are using an open source database, and the open source database is maintained by a particular company named MongoDB. As long as you were taking the database from the MongoDB company, there was a chance that if you need support, you will turn to them. But then other company started offering MongoDB as a service. For you as the user, the choice is to build and service the database by yourself or to have it serviced for you. And if you use the serviced version, original contributors will lose a lot of their income, even if that's not visible at the first sight. This is actually an unintended consequence of the licensing, trademarks, and patents, and a weakness in the strategy of the original contributors. Even more, this is the biggest source of a noise in the community because original contributors will suffer from sustainability issues. They have probably a lot of people who works on the open source product, but they don't get anything in return. The loop isn't closed for them. And what they try to do is to adopt different licenses. Like, for example, MongoDB migrated their database to a server-side license, which basically said that if you want to run it as a service, you have to publish your entire solution code and make it available to everyone. It was an attempt to nullify all the businesses that offered the database as a service. Now, if you are relying on the application whose main vendor or main contributor is in this situation, this is quite a difficult place to be in, because you can expect that the original vendor may have financial issues. And at the same time, the other vendor who is offering us a service, it may be a bit word, but it's a bit of being parasitic in approach. This vendor may have bigger returns in the future and may actually replace the original one. So I trust the best strategy in this space is to wait until the situation is clear and then side with the winner. Not a very risky thing to a business unless you have to provide support for your products that use that database for extended period of time. So with the concept of intent, I've started looking into different projects and I've tried to figure out what groups or categories of intent are there out in the world. And what I found out is that there are 4 categories, and the first one are open source projects, or generally open projects focused around research. This is the space where you use open to gather people who want to explore a particular space, like, for example, IoT. Of course, there's a threat because some organizations may not need human brain power, but they can rely on data to figure out what is actually selling best. But in the research, what is important is that contributors get back recognition, but that's not the most important factor. The open communication matters most. If you remember the battle between Firefox and Internet Explorer, I trust it was the open communication which made Firefox such a great browser in the first place. Because people who worked for the Mozilla Foundation, they were able to connect to users directly and figure out what are their use cases and what those people need and want much faster than Microsoft could in terms of Internet Explorer. Recognition, the mechanism of recognition, is also something that can bring very good PR to the organization that supports it. Note that because you are exploring some new area and you've built a group, or you assembled a group of people who work in a given space, I wouldn't expect any immediate returns or profits in this space. Because you are exploring and you don't know whether you will find something. There is a specific subcategory of the research projects, and those actually have usually a very tangible outputs in terms of increased efficiency and innovations elsewhere. This is more or less the equivalent of supporting, let's say, genetics labs in your country by building open source version of expensive lab equipment and software, especially if those are protected by intellectual property. Why? Because then you can buy more equipment, have more labs, and you will hope that with the lower cost of setting up those labs, they will produce better results or more of them. The trick with this one is that the open source solution has to be actually tax funded. It's quite difficult to imagine a situation where a corporation, especially those focused on profits, create open source solutions to help other corporations without expecting anything in return. Frankly and historically, the single biggest innovation booster in the United States was when Bell Systems was forced to license their patents during the antitrust settlement. This wasn't technically open sourcing anything, but it was about giving all the patents they have for other corporations to use. This triggered a boom around those patents because those corporations in the field, they didn't have or weren't forced to pay hefty sums to use existing solutions. What's super interesting is that China seems to have entire legal system built around this. While in the United States, there are patents, utility patents, which last 20 years or cover the invention for 20 years. In China, there are patents which are invention patents and utility patents. Invention patents are more or less like American utility patents. They cover the invention for 20 years and they are very thoroughly checked for the innovations. On the other hand, utility patents in China are granted very easily and they are granted only for 10 years. This is basically a repeatable process that does the same antitrust trial that happened in the United States and involved Bell Systems. The next category of open source projects is named Endowments. Those projects are built because people can do it. I've mentioned that there are projects, open source projects, created by people who believe in something. Sometimes those projects serve greater good, such as open source ecology, which built basic tools for the Africa, or Open Lung project, which tried to build open ventilators for current times. And sometimes those are like games or mini games written because the author wished to do so, or to do something cool, or had just too much time. This category of projects relies on donations, and it's important to recognize that before anything else. There is no direct monetization. There is no expected monetization upfront. And if a project in this category happens to have business value and you happen to use it, who will pay for the actual work? The biggest risk in this category is when the author of a project changes his or her jobs, goes to jail, it happened, or will have to take care of dependent ones. In such a case, if the project is small, it can die. Unfortunately, this seems to be the default way of operating for many projects. That's why we probably have so many small open source projects. The next category of project has a name Neutralizers, and as the name implies, they are here to neutralize the power and risk associated with other organizations. I will explain that in a second. Projects in this category can be easily recognized because they are re-implementation of well-known, usually very pricey or strategic commercial products. Again, imagine a situation where you believe that the future requires artificial intelligence. It's not so unthinkable. To deliver AI capabilities, you need to have some know-how and some processor capable of doing computations. To have processors, you need the factory, and to have the factory, to run the factory, you need some intellectual property. Now, consider the scenario in which there is a trade war and you lose access to the intellectual property. Would you jeopardize your future because you failed to take care for intellectual property or to understand your value chain? And what if the intellectual property holder starts charging a lot for the property, for his or her property? You will not be in a very good situation. That's why you can pay for opening it up. This is actually the situation that happened in the exactly in this field, in the AI space and in the processing power space. For many years, companies were relying on ARM, on the ARM Corporation, to provide specification for chipsets. But a couple of years ago, a RISC-V Foundation was created, and the goal of the RISC-V Foundation is to provide open specification, so everyone can use it and build their own chips. The power of the original intellectual property creator was neutralized. Now, what's important in this space is that I found also a company that considered open sourcing their main asset. They wanted to boost adoption. It was a voice recognition solution that would have ended well for the solution, but not for the company. Just note that if you are betting on the AI and you need intellectual property, you are opening intellectual property for everyone. So you better have different sources of revenue. IBM in 1980s created almost open design of a personal computer, but the design was protected by only one proprietary component, the basic input-output system, the BIOS. It got challenged in the court, lost the case, and BIOS was no longer protecting the architecture. Personal computers set the standard for many decades. They removed all the other approaches from the market, or nearly removed. So it was a great success for the architecture, but IBM had to quit the market. It wasn't able to compete with all the cheaper providers that used the same specification. This is the risk associated with neutralizing your own competitive advantage. And a final category, which are gambits, and that category relies on the assumption that you give up control over some project, but there is some dependency which will create future value for you. In other words, it's pure baiting. There is a weak business link. It's like, this is the open source project, you can use it, or you can pay us for the commercial version which adds tons of features which you would have to re-implement by yourself. It doesn't make sense to use the open version. Every reasonable person will pay for the commercial one. Open acts as a bait in this space. Actually, if you think about the triangle that I have started this presentation with, if you are putting out an open solution, you hope that you will get commercial requests in terms of support or in terms of sponsored development or consulting work. But there is an indirect way, and this is when the open source solution or the open solution has a commercial requirement. Think, for example, of Blender, which is a 3D modeling software. It's open source, and organizations who donate to that project are either filmmakers. For them, this is the neutralization of the very expensive software corporations that produce filmmaking software. But what I found very hilarious, there are supporters who are hardware producers, which make processors and 3D printers. And it actually makes a lot of sense, because if you want to render a 3D scene, you need a powerful graphic card. And if you want to design a 3D design, you need a printer. If the integration is close, you will get an entire solution stack. But again, the fact of being open source, it's not the most critical one. The fact of being available for free and easy to learn is more important than user rights to modify the software. The threat in this category is that the dependency, this commercial requirement brought by the solution, will be used by somebody else. If you think about Kubernetes, which is a container management system, it was created by Google, and Google is the biggest contributor to date. But if you look at the market share, the solution was adopted by Amazon, Azure, and a number of different companies. Now, it doesn't have to be something bad, because sometimes it's better to have a small piece of a big cake than a big piece of a small cake. But in this case, it looks like Amazon and Azure are the beneficiaries of Google's work. Now, if you have those 4 categories of intents in your mind, there is a question how to use it. And this isn't rather a simple question, because for open source, there are 2 kinds of risk associated with it. One is that you rely on a dependency that has sustainability issues, on a small project that is critical for your organization, but you don't know it. And this problem space has been analyzed, and there are organizations such as the To-Do group, which publish best practices and help organizations to identify and manage dependencies. Small projects, especially in the endowment category, while looking most risky at the first sight, are not that dangerous. If something goes wrong and you discover it, you can easily fund another developer to fix the project. But the condition is that you know that you depend on that project. Bigger projects require a bit more thorough analysis. If the project is too big for you to support, you may be forced to migrate to another solution at some point in time, or to start paying for the development out of your own pocket. It may be worth to analyze what is the expected lifespan of your solution, and what are the incentives, and what is the contributor situation who contribute to the software, to the open projects that you are using. If your solution is expected to live longer than open source projects, perhaps it may be worth to build a little bit of flexibility into your solution and prepare yourself for the switch. But again, to do that, you have to know what open projects are you using. However, what's more interesting, and what's actually extremely interesting to me, are strategic uses of open source which tie people using the open source project to your organization, or which neutralize the power of corporations that compete with you. Those are actually missed opportunities, because if you don't use open approaches, you will probably never know that you've missed an opportunity. Because the world or your environment will continue to look like it looks right now. The question that you should be asking yourself right now is where open approaches can be used in your situation to improve your position. How can you use open approaches to gain something more in return, to get this incoming loop from the community around you? Unfortunately, I don't have a checklist. I don't have an answer for this, because the answer depends on your situation, players which are involved in it, your position in the market, available budget, etc., etc. It has to be done case by case. The first step is building situational awareness and understanding what dependencies are between various projects. If you would like to get started and learn how to spot opportunities for using open approaches, let us know.
Yeah, Chris, I actually had a couple of clients reach out to me on this topic, and one of the questions they had was around open data. And where does that fit into this picture, and what does that look like given everything you discussed today?
The concept of open data is a very interesting one, because the original contributor, what is the original contributor releasing? What is the original contributor actually obtaining? Most of the time, when we think about open data, we think about data that we can use in any way we want. But the problem with data is that it's usually quite expensive to transfer data between different data centers, and it's much cheaper to send the program to be close to the data, which means that there is a hidden commercial requirement that if you want to use open data, you have to use the cloud infrastructure that is provided out there by the same contributor which provided data. Data acts as a bait. But if you have a true open source data, like you can use it, modify it, and publish it elsewhere, the risk is that other companies, such as Amazon, they will copy the data and expose it on their platform. This can happen, and sometimes it's even desired, when we have data that is sponsored by governments and it is supposed to be used for the public good. And it's something expected. But usually, what we call open data is not very open, and it has a lot of limitations, like, for example, quotas, allowing you to ask or to run on a certain number of queries, or licenses which prevent you from selling your results. And there is usually a commercial license somewhere out there to buy. So I would consider open data being a pure bait to win more customers.
Great, thank you for clarifying. I think those on joining today's call will find that helpful. Another question that came to me was around support for open source projects. So how does someone who's utilizing this and wants to utilize this get their team, their colleagues, and even their companies more engaged and supporting open source projects, especially ones that they find really important to them?
So I would say it's about not stopping employees from contributing to open source. Many people think highly of open source and they believe in the ideas. But on the other hand, in people's contracts, they usually seize all the rights to their intellectual property on behalf of the company that hires them. Sometimes they cannot contribute anything without going through a lengthy compliance process. Perhaps if you want to make sure that your employees contribute to the projects, especially those projects that are important to you, and there is no important for your organization intellectual property involved, perhaps it would be wise to do something as simple as give your employees a list of projects, say which of those are most important, and then let them figure out the rest. To get there, you actually need to have a talk with your chief risk operating person and with your head of compliance or legal team, because those are two sources in your organization which most probably introduced controls which prevent your employees from contributing to open source.
Great. And just before we close out today's session, what do you think is the most important next step that those listening to the session today can take in this journey?
Okay, so it depends on their exact situation. If they know what open source projects are they using, then it is probably looking at their environment and seeking for opportunities to use open source to improve their position in the market, which basically means building situational awareness. Wordplay mapping can be helpful in that. But if people listening don't know what's their stack, they don't know what open projects are they using, then indexing the stack is perhaps more important.
Great. Well, I think that's a great note to end on today. On behalf of Chris and myself and the Leading Edge Forum, we thank you for listening to this session. Please don't hesitate to reach out to Chris or myself to continue the discussion. And thank you again.
I would love to hear your thoughts and comments, so drop me a line. Thank you for your time again.